For most of human history, the idea of a death sentence being humane was a ridiculous thought. The entire point was to instill fear, and this was typically done by concocting the most outlandishly horrific execution the human mind could muster. Some of these methods were so brutal that they seem almost surreal today, yet they were very, very real. Today, we'll explore 3 of the most excruciating execution methods ever devised. These sentences weren't just about putting an end to the victim's life, it was about making an example of the condemned, turning their agony into a public spectacle that reinforced the absolute power of those in charge. Deterrence was everything. We'll be starting off with the most drawn out and arguably most horrifying: Scaphism, also known as the boats. Scaphism was an execution method from ancient Persia designed not only to kill but also torture the victim, drawing out their agony for days or even weeks. It's infamously documented by the Greek historian Plutarch, who describes the punishment of Mithridates, a Persian soldier whose crime of boasting cost him his life in the most horrific way imaginable. Mithridates served under King Artaxerxes II, who ruled the Persian Empire, a vast civilization that covered parts of modern-day Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Egypt during the 4th century BC. Artaxerxes' reign was marked by internal strife, including a failed rebellion led by his brother Cyrus the Younger. In the aftermath of this conflict, Mithridates claimed he had killed Cyrus himself, hoping to gain fame and favour. But this boast directly contradicted the king's narrative that his loyal forces were the ones responsible. For this perceived challenge to the royal story, King Artaxerxes personally sentenced Mithridates to death by Scaphism. According to Plutarch's book, The Life of Artaxerxes, the king decreed that Mithridates should be put to death in boats, which execution is after the following manner. Taking 2 boats framed exactly to fit and answer each other, they lay down in one of them the malefactor that suffers upon his back. Then, covering it with the other, and so setting them together that the head, hands and feet of him are left outside, and the rest of his body lies shut up within, then forcing him to ingest a mixture of milk and honey before pouring all over his face and body. The milk and honey served a dual purpose. It not only kept the victim alive that much longer, but also induced severe diarrhea, which would accumulate inside the boats. Why? Well, the worst was yet to come. Plutarch continues, "They then kept his face continually turned towards the sun, and it becomes completely covered up and hidden by the multitude of flies that settle on it. And as within the boats, he does what those that eat and drink must need do. Creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption and rottenness of the excrement, and these entering into the bowels of him, his body is consumed." You'd think this would be ill fate enough, leaving him to die in this manner, but nope, not yet. Each day, Mithridates was dragged out of the boats, force-fed again, and inspected to ensure he was still alive, just to be put back into his living grave. Now, this process would usually bring the victim to his end in a matter of days, but Mithridates, tenacious as he was, endured the unimaginable for over 2 weeks. Just shy of 17 days. His body desperately clung to life as the infection whittled away at him, the endless swarms of flies, bees and wasps eating and burrowing their way into his body as the worms ate their way out, causing unending pain and humiliation. Humiliation because as he died slowly, painfully, and alone, he knew that not only did his life end here, but that this would be his legacy. You see, the boats were often placed in public areas like riverbanks where passers-by could witness the slow, agonising death and the absolute stench and disgust of the entire affair, along with the victim's hysteria and descent into insanity, ensuring that, along with their life, they also lost their dignity. Why would they do this though? According to Greek historian Ctesias, whose writings provide us insight into Persian court life, he noted that the purpose of Scaphism was not just to kill, but to utterly degrade the victim, turning them into a living spectacle of suffering, which served as a stark warning to anyone who might consider defying the king or otherwise stepping out of line. Cross me, and you'll die as less than a human. You'd think that when faced with such a fate, people would do everything they could to avoid it, including ending things themselves rather than waiting to be eaten alive. Unfortunately though, as we mentioned earlier, the victims were trapped tightly between the two boats, hands and feet bound in place, and thus unable to move at all, let alone enough to take any action. It was seemingly as cruel and dehumanising as an execution could get. Also, you'd think, thousands of miles away in Imperial China, Lingi, or death by 1,000 cuts, challenged that notion, as it too served a similar purpose, to inflict extreme suffering while maintaining the power and control of the state through fear and cruelty. Lingi, as opposed to the ease with which we've just witnessed Scaphism being dished out, was reserved for crimes considered the most severe, such as treason or the murder of close family members, typically one's parents. This form of execution was notorious for the deliberate and systematic dismemberment of the victim, turning their death into a gory spectacle. It originated during the Tang dynasty towards the end of the first millennia AD, but became more widely used during the following Song and Yuan dynasties a few hundred years later. But it persisted until as recently as 1912, before being prohibited due to growing pressure from Western powers. The word Lingi itself translates to slow slicing or lingering death, emphasising its drawn-out nature. The executioner's task was not merely to kill, but to prolong the suffering of the condemned, ensuring their death was no quick matter. Sir Henry Norman, a British parliamentarian who witnessed this for himself, describes it in his book, The People and Politics of the Far East. The executioner, grasping handfuls from the fleshy parts of the body, such as the thighs and breasts, slices them away. The limbs are cut off piecemeal at the wrists and ankles, the elbows and knees, shoulders and hips. Finally, the condemned is stabbed to the heart and the head is cut off. The best documented and last recorded state-sanctioned instance of Lingi occurred in 1905, when a man named Fao Chu-li, a Mongol guard, was executed in Beijing for the murder of his master, a Mongolian prince, after said prince had attempted to force himself onto the man's wife. Fao Chu-li was tied to a wooden frame in a public square, where his execution was witnessed by Western diplomats, missionaries and photographers, which means we have photographs of the entire process. It's way too graphic for YouTube, but I'll leave a link down below in the description. Be warned though, it's pretty grim stuff, and these pictures eventually helped to end the practice of Lingi once the public en masse could see how grotesque it was. As the process began, the executioner started with small cuts to the limbs and chest, slowly removing the flesh in a ritualistic manner. French observer Georges Dumas, who was present at the execution, is quoted in the book Death by 1,000 Cuts as saying, "Each incision was deliberate, a testament to the skill of the executioner. His knife flickered, tearing flesh from the bone, and yet the condemned man still drew breath." This slow, methodical process could take hours, with executioners explicitly trained to keep the condemned alive for as long as possible. The final cuts, often to the heart or neck, were reserved for when death seemed imminent, ensuring the maximum amount of suffering had been inflicted. Often, executioners would be bribed by the families of the condemned to administer opium to the victim, or even to subtly perform the aforementioned final cuts first, thus essentially saving the victim from their suffering, leaving the corpse to be sliced up instead. In the case of Fao Chu-li, however, no such luxury was afforded. He reportedly endured the better half of 100 incisions before his death, an ordeal that stunned onlookers and highlighted the stark cruelty of Lingi. Most would have bled out long before this point, but Fao Chu-li's spirit had held strong, far past the limits of most. Unfortunately though, it's his spirit that was next in line. Lingi brought not only unfathomable physical pain, but also serious cultural and spiritual implications. You see, in Confucian society, maintaining bodily integrity is considered essential, and thus mutilation in death was believed to impede the spirit's ability to find peace in the beyond. A relevant passage that touches on this is found in the Zhao Jing, which states, "Our bodies, to every hair and bit of skin, are received from our parents, and we must not presume to injure or wound them. This is the beginning of filial piety." So not only were these victims, like in Scaphism, turned into an agonising public spectacle, they were also, according to their beliefs, robbed of peace in the afterlife through this ritualistic torment. You'd think this would be unbeatable, but there's more to be seen as we've got one more entry to cover. Going back a couple of millennia ago and a few thousand kilometres southwest to Southern Asia, we find the practice of Garo, or execution by elephant. Seen as symbols of strength, royalty and divine will, elephants were trained to carry out executions with a terrifying mix of precision and brutality. This practice was employed by several empires, including the Mughals, Marathas, and various regional sultanates across India from as early as the Mauryan period, around 300 to 150 BC, all the way up until the 20th century, when British colonial influence led to its decline. It was a common punitive measure for high treason, military desertion, and even tax evasion, aimed at, again, not only inflicting death, but also creating a dramatic public spectacle that reinforced the ruler's dominance, just like the other methods in this video. Unlike the other methods, however, this particular form of execution had a decent degree of variety to it, with the only real constant being the elephant itself. Boundless was the creativity of the South Asian executioners, and thankfully, we've plenty of first-hand accounts to paint us as accurate a picture as possible. One such account, for example, tells us of a man's death dating back to 1330s, as told by the Muslim traveller Ibn Battuta, who witnessed the execution during a visit to Delhi. Upon a certain day, when I myself was present, some men were brought out who had been accused of having attempted the life of the vizier. They were ordered, accordingly, to be thrown to the elephants, which had been taught to cut their victims to pieces. Their hooves were cased with sharp iron instruments, and the extremities of these were like knives. On such occasions, the elephant driver rode upon them, and when a man was thrown to them, they would wrap the trunk around him and toss him up, then take him between the teeth and throw him between their forefeet upon the breast, and do just as the driver should bid them. And according to the orders of the emperor, if the order was to cut him to pieces, the elephant would do so with his irons and then throw the pieces among the assembled multitude. But if the order was to leave him, he would be left lying before the emperor until the skin should be taken off and stuffed with hay and the flesh given to the dogs. Let's jump a little bit closer to the present. In 1814, another such torture and execution took place in Baroda, with its testimony found in the Percy anecdotes. The man was a slave, and 2 days before had murdered his master, brother to a native chieftain called Amir Sahib. About 11 o'clock, the elephant was brought out with only the driver on his back, surrounded by natives with bamboos in their hands. The criminal was placed 3 yards behind on the ground, with his legs tied by 3 ropes, which were fastened to a ring on the right hind of the elephant. At every step the elephant took, it jerked him forward, and every 10 or 8 steps must have dislocated another limb, for they were loose and broken when the elephant had proceeded 500 yards. The man, though covered in mud, showed every sign of life, and seemed to be in the most excruciating torments. After having been tortured in this manner for about an hour, he was taken to the outside of town, when the elephant, which is instructed for such purposes, was backed and put his foot on the head of the criminal. As you can see, there was no shortage of creativity when it came to dispensing punishment. These accounts, mind you, are merely 2 of many. Countless tales can be found of the most horrendously brutal deaths at the hands, or well, the trunks, of these beasts and their masters. Some were stomped, some were sliced with bladed tusks or tossed repeatedly until their bodies turned to paste. Some were even dismembered, left to bleed out, and others were simply impaled or crushed under the animal's massive weight. Thankfully, as we mentioned, the British colonial influence in the region did take away this practice. In 1914, Eleanor Maddock noted that in Kashmir, since the arrival of Europeans, many of the old customs are disappearing, and one of these is the dreadful custom of the execution of criminals by an elephant trained for the purpose, and which was known by the hereditary name of Garo. As insane and outlandish as the brutality of these punishments may seem to us now, it's worth noting that this was literally a part of everyday life for most of civilized human history. People often do things they shouldn't. And in most older societies, where jail was a privilege, this meant many met their fate in ways seemingly pulled straight out of a nightmare. I've been Jake, this has been Flashback, and we will see you next time. You like that, did you? You're still here, so I'm guessing you did. And if that's true, click one of these videos here to watch more. It's the best way you can support our channel and help me. In the meantime, thanks for watching. It really helps.